There was never any controlling Janis Joplin. In her music, she was a freewheeling ball of energy and emotion. Raw, beautiful, vulnerable and strong. In life, she was much the same.
Janis Joplin, I think, sums up the kind of freewheeling madness of the 60s, but also had this incredible voice that was so unique and really cut through at a time when no one else was singing like her.
Janis Joplin, I think it's fair to say, was the first female artist in the 60s that took on the men at their own game and really beat them.
She was an extraordinary singer. The power of that voice. To me, she is one of the great soul singers.
Well, you know you got it if it makes you feel good. Oh, yes, indeed.
It was the Monterey International Pop Festival in 1967 where it really began. Janis Joplin was 24. She had been singing with Big Brother and the Holding Company for just a year. The psychedelic rock group were not well known even in their hometown of San Francisco. But here they were at Monterey in front of 40,000 people. Few there had heard of Janis Joplin, but soon everyone would be talking about her.
She did Ball and Chain, you know, the old blues, and she did it absolutely brilliantly.
She was so incredible that the organisers actually asked her to perform a second time over the 3-day event because they were so amazed at this voice and this performance and this woman who was, you know, absolutely mesmerising on stage.
Very, very powerful performance, brilliant vocals, but also just this kind of force of nature that she presented herself as.
After the festival, Columbia Records offered Big Brother and the Holding Company a contract, but it was Janis they were after.
What made Janis really stand out was that she came along at a time in rock music which was the counter-revolution. You know, it wasn't about having a 3-minute hit. You had to have more going for you than that. And although the 60s had a great many wonderful American female singers, they didn't have a rock star.
And they're very much a San Francisco band, you know, part of that movement with the Grateful Dead, Jefferson Airplane. So they're part of that period, which was the kind of, really the key hippie revolution, psychedelic flowering of America.
In August 1968, they released Cheap Thrills. It went to #1 8 weeks later. It was just the band's second album, but it would be the last to feature Janis Joplin.
I think Janis split with Big Brother and the Holding Company because she outgrew them. More and more they were being billed with her name first, and I think that probably created some resentment in the group that she was the last one to join. But also she had bigger ambitions, maybe.
Summer, child, the living's easy.
And Janis Joplin was getting a lot of word in her ear from other people saying, you're the star, you're incredible, you don't need these guys. And, you know, that fell apart.
It was a cruel thing because they were her kind of gang in a way, but I think ultimately it was the right decision.
Joplin's management put together a new backing group for her, the Cosmic Blues Band. Janis Joplin's first solo album was released in 1969. It moved away from psychedelic rock towards the sounds of blues and soul. Its new sound allowed her voice to take center stage.
There's something about it which sounds like she's just downed a bottle of Jack Daniels, she's smoked at least 2 packets of Marlboros, and she could still sing her heart out. So it's a voice which is kind of, all the experience and sins of life are in there, but at the same time she's pulling out this great passion and power.
She has this kind of coarseness to her voice, but at the same time, this incredible vocal range. And what her voice allows her to do is really change from singing to wailing to screaming in a way that sounds like it should be awful, but actually is wonderful. And everything she sings, you feel what she's feeling.
Don't you know it's time?
Big influences on her musical development, but I think also on her character development, were singers like Bessie Smith and Ma Rainey. Now, these are the great empresses of the blues from the 1930s and 40s, and these were very powerful women, very strong, sexually progressive, brilliant blues singers.
She's a mythic figure almost, for her energy, her clothes, the way she carries herself on stage and off.
Joplin was far from an undisciplined screamer. She worked at her craft, learning the hard way at tiny venues. Just her, a guitar, an auto harp, and that voice. Even for a taboo-shaking decade like the 60s, Joplin was a trailblazer, and not just on stage. She was a middle-class young woman challenging every notion of how she was meant to be.
She loves to get out of it. She loves to get out of it, to get into it, to get out of it, to get into it. And San Francisco at that moment is the place to be for someone that doesn't want to walk down the straight and narrow, someone that doesn't want a job.
She was, on a good day, a real laugh. She was a really bright, you know, quite well-read, interesting person, but she was, at heart, she was a pretty unhappy soul.
Despite sporadic attempts to stay clean, Joplin's drug addiction grew. It had started when she first came to San Francisco in 1963.
By the late 60s, Janis Joplin was spending $200 a day on heroin, which is, well, it's a lot of money now, but then it was a huge amount.
Just a little bit harder, so I can...
2 years after Monterey, Janis was invited to appear at another legendary music festival. She arrived at Woodstock by helicopter, giving her a perfect view of the vast crowds that awaited her. It would be the biggest music festival in the world, but it was not the best organized.
Janis has this awful 10-hour wait before she can actually get on stage. And it wasn't like someone said it's going to be 10 hours. It was an hour or two. And it goes on and it goes on. And Janis, being Janis, decides to spend the time, A, drinking bourbon, Southern Comfort whiskey, and B, injecting heroin, injecting more heroin. So by the time the band finally come on stage at 2 a.m., she's a mess.
Her voice was very hoarse. She was kind of all over the place.
She's still good, you know, she's Janis Joplin, but it wasn't one of the classic performances.
It was only the second gig that the Cosmic Blues Band played together, so they weren't really that tight.
Even Janis on an off night was incredible. Few in the crowd could conceive that the singer had little more than a year left to live. Paul Rothchild was worried. The music producer had been working with Janis Joplin for months. Her second solo album was almost finished, and the singer was due in the studio that afternoon to record some final vocals. But she hadn't appeared. Finally, Rothchild sent road manager John Cook to check on the star. He went to the cheap Hollywood motel where Joplin had been staying. Her car, an unmistakable psychedelic Porsche, was parked outside. Gaining access to her room, he found Joplin on the floor, dead from a heroin overdose.
When Janis Joplin died, I think there was a sad inevitability to it for the people who knew her. There were friends and colleagues who talked about how they were just waiting for the day they'd get that phone call, but also a great sense of shock and sadness from across the world.
A woman left lonely.
In the time leading up to her death, Janis was actually on the crest of a wave.
The career was on the up. You know, there wasn't, whatever problems she was having with drugs and health and so forth, you know, she was a huge star.
In February 1970, Janis Joplin went to Brazil. She went with a boyfriend who wasn't into drugs. She started cleaning up, preparing herself really for the next stage in her career. And then she did a very successful tour of Canada called the Festival Express, which travelled by train. This was with Buddy Guy and the band. And it seemed like things were getting back on track.
And then she'd put together this band, the Full Tilt Boogie Band, to record a new album. And there was a sense of her being refocused on her music. She was trying very hard to stay clean.
These are great musicians, actually a much better band, making much better music. And I think Janis loved it.
Not long before her death, she recorded a fantastic acoustic blues called Mercedes-Benz. Which is the last thing she recorded. Her voice is still great, very weathered, but she still had this incredible ability to capture the blues, really like no other white woman did.
Oh Lord, won't you buy me a Mercedes-Benz? My friends all drive Porsches, I must make amends. Worked hard all my lifetime, no help from my friends. So oh Lord, won't you buy me a Mercedes-Benz?
You can hear the coarseness to it, but also you can hear what a great singer she is as well. And there's just the simplicity of her and her voice.
Already stunned by the death of Jimi Hendrix just 16 days earlier, the world now had to cope with the loss of another young talent.
Freedom is just another word for nothing left to lose. Nothing, don't mean nothing, honey, if it ain't free.
Janis was cremated and her ashes scattered over the Pacific Ocean. There was no grave for fans to mourn at, but in the months following, artists such as Leonard Cohen, Joan Baez and the Mamas and the Papas all paid tribute to her in song.
The whole mythology that's now grown up around Janis Joplin is of course to do with her early death. That weird coincidence that she died at 27, which was the age Jimi Hendrix died at, which was the age Jim Morrison would die at less than a year later. She's become part of that.
It was so shocking at the time that we lost all three of those, and it was such a sort of, you know, warning bell. It's like, you know, the counterculture is out of control. These really bad drugs have come in. This isn't just hippies smoking joints on the village green anymore.
The album she was working on was released in January 1971. Pearl was the hit Janis had been hoping for. The record showcased a new maturity in the singer. Joplin had worked well with her new band and with producer Paul Rothchild. Carefully chosen material was matched with precise arrangements. But the album cannot be separated from the events surrounding it. It remains unfinished, a cruel reminder of potential lost.
The song she was due to come in and sing the day she died was Buried Alive in the Blues, which is just an instrumental on the album as a result.
I think with Janis Joplin, more than many artists, there is this overwhelming sense of what might have been. You know, she'd made this huge splash with the Big Brother holding company, and now she's poised as a solo artist. But she'd have made dozens of albums. She'd have done great tours.
She might have gone to somewhere like Muscle Shoals and made a real kind of, you know, funky R&B album down there with those guys. You know, who knows? But I think musically, she would have continued to make good choices.
She probably would have honed her skills as a blues singer. I think she had a great love for the blues. But I think she would have liked to continue the legacy of singers like Bessie Smith and Ma Rainey, and to an extent even, you know, maybe kind of more jazz side of things, people like Ella Fitzgerald, Nina Simone. I could see her going in that direction.
In 1988, a memorial to Janis was unveiled in Port Arthur. In life, her hometown had rejected her, and she it. But in death, thousands gathered to honour the town's most famous daughter. Later, she was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
Place you so definitely deserve to be.
And in 2005, she was celebrated at the Grammys with a posthumous Lifetime Achievement Award. She is recognised today as one of the most influential and important singers of not just her era, but of all rock history. Joplin had an unmistakable voice, soulful and passionate. It strutted with power and ached with vulnerability. Her live shows were transcendent, almost religious experiences. She fed off the audience and they fed off her. But beneath her bravado and those wild performances, there was deep pain in Janis Joplin. She had been an outsider from early on. She didn't fit in at home in that oil town in southeast Texas. She was bullied and excluded, and the first real chance she got, she left. But she never really escaped.
I think through being bullied at an early age, it gave Janis Joplin a feeling of being an outsider and of not wanting to fit in with how everyone else was.
It completely affected her. It made her incredibly self-conscious, first of all. But then I think it made her defiant. But I also think it affected her in a need for acceptance. She became very promiscuous. She became, you know, the great party girl. And I think all of that was probably born from this kind of sadness and feeling undesired and unloved and unwanted.
She didn't ever quite fit in anywhere. So I think she was a desperately lonely figure, and I think self-destructive for sure. You know, the fact that she was shooting heroin while drinking bottles of bourbon while on her own shows just how desperate that poor woman was.
So someone comes along, he gonna give you some love and affection. I'd say get it while you can, yeah. Honey, get it while you can, yeah.
As an adult, she had few friends she could truly rely upon. Increasingly, she numbed her pain with drink, drugs, and sex. It was a life that summed up the late 60s. Impulsive, instinctive, concerned not with past or future, but the here and now. Joplin's death, however, revealed the darker side to the hippie dream. The drugs she took were not a gateway to new enlightenment, but an ever-deepening pit. Joplin was not the first or last to find escape from it impossible.
She knew she was in trouble. She did try to do something about it, but she'd always relapse. She'd always come back to the drugs.
The drugs robbed the world of a musical genius, a young woman on the cusp of greatness, a young woman whose dreams remain tantalizingly unfulfilled.
I think the influence of Janis Joplin is there to this day. Like all the great artists, it's finding people that took what she did as a launch pad to do their own thing. And it can be on the surface, it could be someone like Suzi Quatro in the 70s, right up to someone like Amy Winehouse.
I think Janis Joplin's legacy is not only in her incredible voice, but also in what she stood for as a woman in music, especially in the world of rock and roll, which was very male-dominated at that time.
She kind of set the template for people like Stevie Nicks and Florence Welch and countless other singers who have got a kind of romantic sensibility combined with the power of the voice. So I think her legacy is really a great female blues rock singer.
Her life, you know, has subsequently been portrayed on stage, many books, The movie in the 70s, The Rose, starring Bette Midler, is essentially based on the life of Janis Joplin. You know, the idea of the ballsy chick who doesn't take any crap from anybody, it kind of began with Janis Joplin.
But she's part of that group of late 60s musicians who sort of define what rock and roll is.